The city of Varel burned under a red sky. The air was thick with smoke. The sound of explosions shaking the very ground. Once it had been the jewel of the Zarian Empire. Home to marble towers and glowing streets. Now it was nothing more than a battlefield in the center of this chaos. A young, noble alien girl stood on the balcony of her family's grand palace. Her long silver hair shimmered even in the dim light of fire, and her blue eyes held both fear and pride. She was Lady Saranya, of House Vale, daughter of one of the most powerful rulers in the sector. But at that moment, power meant nothing. The enemy forces had breached the gates, and the palace guards were falling one by one. Her people screamed in the streets, desperate to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Saranya's father had sent her to the highest tower for safety, but the enemy was closing in from every side. A sudden crash shook the palace. Stone dust fell from the ceiling as the balcony's railing cracked. Saranya stumbled backward, clutching her ceremonial dress, which was far too heavy for running through the smoke. She saw a movement to shadow leaping across the courtyard with impossible speed. Her first thought was that it was an enemy soldier. But as the figure came closer, she realized it was a human, a tall man in worn armor, carrying a plasma rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was covered in soot, and one side of his armor was dented from battle. Yet his eyes were sharp and alert, scanning every danger. Humans were rare here, almost unheard of in noble circles. Her people saw them as lesser beings, rough, uncultured, and unpredictable. She had been taught never to trust one. So when he landed on the balcony and reached for her arm, her instinct was to pull away. "Come with me if you want to live," he said in a calm but urgent voice. She froze, taken aback by his tone. "I do not take orders from your kind," she spat, her pride rising above her fear. The human's jaw tightened. But he didn't argue. Instead, he glanced behind him. More enemy soldiers were climbing the palace walls. He reached for her again, but she stepped back. "I will wait for my guards," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "Your guards are dead," he said flatly. That truth hit her harder than any explosion. But she still refused to move. The first enemy soldier climbed over the balcony, rail a blade in hand, before Saranya could even react. The human fired a single shot, sending the attacker tumbling into the courtyard below. He turned back to her, his voice low. "This is your last chance." She clenched her fists, her pride screaming at her not to follow him, but her heart pounded as the sound of boots drew closer from the hall. "Go," she ordered instead. Lifting her chin, "I will not run with a human." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, without another word, he turned and leaped back over the balcony. Rail, disappearing into the smoke. Saranya's chest tightened unexpectedly. Had she just made a mistake? Before she could dwell on it, the enemy broke through the door. Shouting in a language she didn't understand, she spun, trying to run deeper into the palace. But her heavy dress slowed her down. 2 soldiers chased her, their footsteps pounding. Behind her, her lungs burned, her heart raced. And every corner of the palace looked the same, ruined and crumbling. She ducked into a side hall, only to find the ceiling had collapsed. Blocking her way, turning back, she realized the soldiers were already there. Weapons raised, her mind screamed at her to fight. But she had no weapon. One soldier stepped forward, his eyes glinting with cruel intent. Saranya's breath caught in her throat, and then, out of nowhere, shadow moved in the smoke behind them. A burst of plasma fire rang out, and both soldiers fell instantly. She turned sharply to see the human again. Rifle still smoking, he didn't speak, didn't gloat. Instead, he tossed something at her feet, a small metallic patch. "It'll stop the bleeding," he said, nodding toward the gash on her arm she hadn't noticed before she could say a word. He was gone again, vanishing into the haze like a ghost. Saranya stood frozen, staring after him. Her pride told her to throw the patch away, but her trembling hands betrayed her. She pressed it against her wound, feeling the burn of the healing agent for a long moment. She just stood there in the flickering light of the burning palace, wondering why a human someone she had insulted would risk his life for her twice. Outside, the city roared with battle, and the night felt endless. Saranya tightened her grip on her torn dress. The human had left her, but a part of her wasn't sure she wanted to let him go. Asterisk smoke still curled from the ruined palace as Lady Saranya stumbled into the dark streets. The night air was cold, but the heat from burning buildings made it hard to breathe. Everywhere she looked, there was chaos, shadows moving, screams echoing, and the constant sound of distant gunfire. She had no map, no guards, and no idea where the safe zones were. Her only thought was to get as far away from the palace as possible. The enemy would surely be searching for her. If they captured her, she knew her fate would be worse than death. She moved through a narrow alley, the heavy folds of her torn gown dragging against the ground. Her feet ached, her lungs burned, and the sharp pain in her arm reminded her of the wound the human had noticed earlier. She touched the metallic patch he had thrown her, feeling its warmth still seeping into her skin. It bothered her that she had used it. It bothered her more that she kept wondering why he had helped her at all. The sound of boots made her freeze. She pressed her back against the wall and held her breath. 3 enemy soldiers passed the mouth of the alley, their armor glowing faintly under the moonlight. She stayed perfectly still until they were gone. Only when their voices faded did she dare to move again. But she had gone only a few steps before something whistled past her ear, an energy bolt hitting the wall beside her. She turned sharply, heart racing. A scout had spotted her, and 2 more were running toward her. Her bare feet slipped on the broken stones as she tried to run. The gown tangled around her legs, slowing her down. She cursed her own stubbornness. Why hadn't she taken the human's offer when she had the chance? She ducked into another alley, weaving between the crumbling walls. Her breathing was ragged, and the echo of footsteps behind her told her the soldiers were gaining. A sharp pain in her side made her stumble. She collapsed behind an overturned market stall. Trying to stay hidden in the shadows, the soldiers' voices were close now. She pressed herself against the cold wall, praying they would pass by. Her eyes darted around the alley, desperate for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Her hands closed around a broken metal pipe. It was heavy and awkward, but it was all she had. The first soldier stepped into view. Saranya tightened her grip, her heart hammering in her ears. But before he could see her, a flash of movement in the darkness caught her eye. It was him, the human. He was crouched low behind a stack of crates, his rifle held steady. He made no sound, but she saw his eyes lock onto hers for a brief second. Then he turned his weapon toward the soldiers. 3 quick shots rang out. The alley fell silent again. The smell of burnt metal filled the air as the soldiers' bodies slumped to the ground. She stared at him, her pride caught between anger and relief. He didn't approach her, didn't even speak. Instead, he reached into his pack and tossed another small item toward her, ration bar wrapped in silver foil. "You'll need it," he said, his voice low and even. She looked at the packet lying near her feet, then back at him. "I didn't ask for your help." "Okay," she said sharply. "And I didn't ask for your thanks," he replied without emotion. Before she could answer, he turned and walked deeper into the shadows. Disappearing again, she sat there for a long moment, the silver packet in her hands. Her stomach ached with hunger, but eating something given by a human felt like defeat. Still, as the night dragged on and the cold bit into her skin, she finally tore it open and took a bite. It was dry, bland, and barely edible, but it gave her just enough strength to keep moving. Hours passed. She wandered through the dead streets, past burning towers and shattered statues. The city she had once ruled over, now felt like a graveyard, every now and then. She saw a shadow moving in the distance. Sometimes she told herself it was the enemy. Other times, she wondered if it was him. It was impossible to tell if he was following her or if it was just her imagination. By the time dawn's pale light touched the horizon, Saranya's legs felt like lead. She found shelter in the remains of an old storage building, curling up in a corner to rest. The faint warmth of the ration bar in her stomach was the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she thought about the human again. He had saved her twice. Now, with no reason, no reward, and no demand for loyalty. Why? She had insulted him, refused him, and yet, peace still came back. Far above the city, the warships still roared in the skies. The battle was far from over. And in her heart, she knew she might not survive another night alone. But she also knew something else. If she saw him again, she might not turn him away this time. The second night came colder than the first. Lady Saranya sat shivering in the corner of the broken storage house. Her thin gown torn and her hair tangled with dust. The fire of the city had burned low, replaced by the chill of wind that crept through shattered windows. Her hands were numb, her lips pale, and every muscle in her body ached from running. She had once eaten the finest foods on silver plates. Now her stomach growled painfully, and the dry ration bar from the human was long gone, she told herself. She could survive without him, that her noble blood would not allow her to depend on a human. But as the hours passed, hunger turned her pride into a slow, gnawing weakness. Her head spun when she tried to stand. Her legs trembled when she walked, and each breath came with a little more effort. By dawn, the cold was worse. The pale sunlight gave no warmth. She left the building. Searching for food or shelter, the streets were quiet, too quiet. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound made her tense. Twice she thought she saw the flicker of movement far away, a figure stepping into an alley before she could focus on it. She told herself it was the enemy, but deep inside, apart. Offer wondered if it was him again. She reached the outskirts of the market district. Once it had been filled with music, colors, and traders from dozens of worlds. Now the stalls were overturned, their goods stolen or burned. She searched through the debris, finding only spoiled fruit and broken glass. When she bent to lift a crate, pain shot through her injured arm, making her hiss. The wound had stopped bleeding thanks to the patch. But the ache was still there. She sat on the cold ground, too tired to move. A sound made her look up. Boots. Her heart leaped into her throat. She turned sharply on. There he was, the human, standing just a few steps away, holding a small canteen in one hand and a strip of dried meat in the other. His armor looked worse than before. Scorched at the edges and dented at the chest, a thin cut ran across his cheek. But his eyes were as calm as the first time she'd seen him. She straightened her back, forcing herself to speak with dignity. "I do not beg for food," she said coldly. He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Then don't beg," he replied, tossing the meat and canteen onto the ground in front of her. "You can take it or leave it." He turned to walk away. Her pride screamed at her to let him go, but her stomach twisted so painfully that she reached out and snatched the food before he was out of sight. "You could at least say thank you," he said without turning. "I will thank you when you earn it," she replied sharply. His shoulders shifted slightly, but he didn't answer. He kept walking, slow but steady. Saranya stared after him, chewing the dried meat. It was tough and salty, but it filled the emptiness in her stomach. The water in the canteen was lukewarm but clean. When she finished, she realized he was still visible in the distance. Moving toward the northern streets, her mind wrestled with itself. She could go the other way and hold on to her pride, or she could follow him, knowing that he seemed to survive far better than she could. She hated the choice, But she hated the cold, the hunger, and the fear even more. By the time the sun had risen higher, she had made her decision. She followed him, keeping her distance. He didn't stop her. Didn't even turn around to acknowledge her. Hours passed. They crossed through ruined neighborhoods. Stepping over rubble and avoiding patrols, she saw how he moved, quick, careful. Always scanning for danger, he carried himself like someone who had done this 100 times before. It was not the clumsy movement she had been taught to expect from humans. It was precise, controlled, dangerous at midday. They reached the edge of a destroyed park. Half-burnt trees cast long shadows over the cracked pathways. The sound of engines made him raise a hand, signaling her to stop. She obeyed without thinking. Enemy patrol vehicles passed nearby, but thanks to his timing, they were unseen. When the danger was gone, he glanced at her. "You're slowing me down." He said simply, "If you want to live, keep up." The words stung, but she nodded. For the rest of the day, she walked closer to him. Still silent, still unwilling to admit she needed him, but every time he stopped to check for danger, she stopped too. Every time he changed direction, she followed without question. When night came, they found shelter in the remains of a collapsed shop. She sat near the wall while he tended to a small fire hidden from sight for the first time since the fall of the palace. She felt a little less cold as she watched him work. She realized something unsettling. Her fate was no longer in her own hands, it was in his. And for the first time, the thought didn't fill her with anger. It filled her with something else she didn't want to name. The fire in the collapsed shop burned low, giving only a faint warmth. Lady Serenia sat with her knees pulled close, watching the human as he checked his weapon. His movements were quiet but efficient. Every action done with care. She could see the dirt and burns on his armor, the scratches across his gloves, the faint limp in his left leg. He had been fighting long before he found her. She wondered how many times he had risked himself for strangers, and why he would do it for her, someone who had given him nothing but cold words. The night outside was silent except for the distant sound of ships in the sky. The enemies still searched for survivors. Serenia shifted uncomfortably on the cold floor. She hated the thought, but she knew she would not survive alone. Not now. Not with the way her body felt weaker each day. When he glanced her way, she quickly looked away, not wanting him to read her thoughts. At dawn, they set out again. The human moved with the same careful pace as before, pausing at every corner, listening before stepping forward. Serenia stayed close behind, her torn dress catching on broken metal and stone. By midday, the streets became narrower, the buildings taller, casting deep shadows. It was here that trouble found them. From the roof above, a blast of plasma fire rained down. The human shoved her hard, forcing her into cover behind a broken wall. Return fire crackled from his rifle, each shot measured and precise. But there were too many shadows moved across the rooftops, and more footsteps approached from both sides of the street. Serenia's heart pounded as the air filled with the scent of burning metal. "They're closing in," she shouted. "I noticed," he replied sharply. Shifting position to shield her from the gunfire, one of the attackers dropped down into the street. Charging at them with a blade, the human met him halfway, the clash echoing through the narrow street. Serenia had never seen someone move like that fast. Controlled, deadly. But even he couldn't block everything. The enemy's blade scraped across his side, cutting through the armor. He grunted but didn't stop, taking the soldier down with a brutal strike. More attackers came. The human fought them one by one, but his breathing grew heavier, his movements slower. Blood darkened the side of his armor, dripping down to the dusty ground. Serenia's throat tightened. She realized he was getting hurt because he was protecting her. If she had been alone, the enemy wouldn't have even bothered. It was her presence that put him in greater danger. A shot rang out, striking the wall. Just above her head, she gasped and ducked lower. The human turned quickly. Placing himself between her and the shooter, another bolt hit him in the shoulder, spinning him slightly. He dropped to one knee, but still raised his rifle with a final burst of fire. He drove the attackers back, their retreating footsteps fading into the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Serenia crawled out from behind the wall and dropped to his side. Blood was seeping through the cracks in his armor. Staining his undershirt, "You're hurt," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Notice that too," he murmured, trying to push himself up, but when he tried to stand, his legs gave out. And he sank back to the ground, without thinking. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress. Pressing it firmly against the worst of his wounds, he winced but didn't push her away. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you fight for me like this?" He looked at her for a long moment, his breathing uneven. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because I don't leave people behind." His words echoed in her mind as she tied the makeshift bandage tighter. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. She had grown up believing that strength meant rank, titles, and wealth. But here was someone with none of those things. Someone bleeding in the dirt, still ready to protect her, and, for the first time, she felt her pride crack. They stayed in the ruins until nightfall. Serenia kept watch while he rested, listening for any sign of danger. Once or twice, she thought she saw movement in the shadows. But no one came close. When he stirred, she helped him to his feet, supporting him as they walked. He didn't protest, though she could feel how much effort it took for him to keep moving. As they limped through the dark streets together, the bond between them changed. She still didn't understand him. But she knew one thing: if the time came, she would fight just as fiercely for him as he had for her. The night air was sharp and cold as Lady Serenia and the human moved through the ruins. His steps were slow, his weight leaning slightly against her. But he still carried his weapon ready. The bandage she had tied on his side was already stained dark. Every time he winced, she felt a strange pull in her chest. She told herself it was concern for her own safety if he fell. She would be alone again, but deep down, she knew it was something more. They found shelter in the remains of an old military outpost. The walls were cracked but still standing, and the roof was mostly intact. Inside, the air was cold but calm, free from the stench of burning streets. He lowered himself onto a broken bench with a quiet groan. Serenia set down a small lantern she had found, its weak light casting shadows across the room. "You should rest," she said. "I will," he replied, checking his rifle one last time before leaning it against the wall. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. She sat on the floor opposite him, hugging her knees. The flicker of the lantern made his face look older, more worn. "Why did you come to Varel?" she asked finally. "Wasn't here for you," he said, without hesitation. "Was here for a job. Then the city fell apart, and yet—" "You helped me," she said quietly. He looked at her, his eyes calm. "I told you before, I don't leave people behind." She wanted to say something sharp, to keep the wall between them standing, but she couldn't. Not after everything she had seen, you know? "In my world, humans are seen as lesser," she admitted slowly. "I know," he said simply. "No anger? No insult?" she asked, surprised by his lack of reaction. He gave a faint smirk. "Your opinion doesn't change who I am." She found herself studying him. His words carried no arrogance, no demand for recognition. It was as if he truly didn't care whether she thought highly of him or not. That confidence unsettled Herbie, because it was the kind she had never seen in the nobles of her own race. The night deepened, and the wind outside whistled through the cracks. She shivered, pulling her dress tighter. Without a word, he took off his battered jacket and tossed it to her, She stared at it for a moment before slipping it on. It was too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands. But the warmth was immediate. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. He shrugged, "Because it's the right thing to do." Before she could answer, a faint noise reached their ears' soft footsteps. He raised a hand, signaling her to be silent. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. Saranya's heart pounded as he reached for his rifle. A shadow appeared at the door, and then another. Figures moved into the lantern like enemy scouts, their weapons drawn. He gestured for her to move behind him. But this time, she didn't. "No," she whispered. "I'm not hiding while you fight alone." He gave her a look, half frustration, half surprise, but there was no time to argue. The first scout lunged forward, and the human fired. The shot echoing through the small space, another came from the side. And Saranya grabbed a loose metal rod from the floor, swinging it with all her strength. It struck the soldier's arm, making him drop his weapon. The human finished the fight. With quick precision, and within moments, the outpost was silent again. She was breathing hard, her hands trembling. "That," he said, lowering his rifle, "was reckless, and yet, we're both alive," she replied, forcing her voice to steady. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Maybe you're not as helpless as you think." The words made something shift inside her. For the first time, she felt like he saw her as more than a burden. It was strange, comforting, but strange. They cleaned up the outpost as best they could, setting the lantern back in place. When they finally settled down again, the silence between them was different. Not cold, not distant, just unspoken understanding. As she drifted toward sleep, Saranya realized something important. The wall she had built between them was cracking, and she wasn't sure she wanted to rebuild it. The morning came with an eerie stillness. The wind had died, the skies were a pale gray, and the city felt too quiet. Lady Saranya woke to find the human already on his feet, tightening the straps of his armor. The blood on his side had dried, but his movements were still stiff. "You should rest longer," she said. "No time," he replied, glancing toward the northern streets. "We need to move before they find this place." She followed him out of the outpost, the cold air biting at her skin. They moved through the ruined streets, their footsteps echoing between the broken walls. For a while, nothing stirred. Then the silence broke. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with every second. The human stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Patrol drones," he said under his breath, before she could ask. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the cover of a collapsed building. The hum became a roar as several drones swept overhead, their red scanning lights sweeping the streets. Saranya held her breath, her heart racing. The human stayed perfectly still, his eyes tracking every movement. The drones passed. Once, twice, then stopped. They hovered for a moment before turning sharply toward the building. "They've found us," he muttered. A blast of plasma fire tore through the wall, forcing them to move. The human pushed her ahead, firing back at the drones. But then the ground shook. Enemy soldiers were closing in from both ends of the street. They ran, weaving through the wreckage. The human fought as they moved, taking down anyone who got too close. But there were too many. A shot clipped his leg, making him stumble. She caught his arm, trying to pull him forward. "This way," she shouted, spotting a narrow alley. They ducked inside, but it was a dead end. The hum of the drones grew louder again. Soldiers were only seconds away, their shadows stretching across the walls. Her mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She turned to him, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" He checked his rifle, his jaw set. "You hide, I'll draw them away," he said. "No," she snapped, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you." "That's better than them killing you," he said firmly. Her chest tightened, her breath quickening for the first time since this nightmare began. She felt fear not for herself, but for him. The shadows grew darker. The sound of weapons charging filled the air. She didn't care about her pride anymore. She didn't care about pride. The lessons she'd been taught about humans. She looked him straight in the eye and shouted, "Help me." It wasn't a command. It wasn't an order. It was a plea, raw and desperate. He froze for just a moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Stay behind me." The first wave of soldiers appeared. The alley exploded into chaos blaster fire, smoke, and the roar of the drones. The human moved like a storm. Every shot from his rifle precise, every step calculated. He took down 3 soldiers in quick succession, ducked under a drone's beam, and hurled a grenade into the advancing line. The explosion shook the walls, filling the alley with dust and debris. Serenia coughed, her ears ringing. When the smoke cleared, she saw him, blood on his arm, dirt across his face, but still standing. "Move." He barked, and they pushed through the gap the explosion had made. They ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they would give way. Only when the city's northern wall came into view did they finally slow. He leaned heavily against the stone, his breathing rough. She stood beside him, her own chest rising and falling rapidly. She had no words, only the pounding of her heart in her ears. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You saved me." Again, he glanced at her, his eyes tired but steady. "You asked?" he said simply. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. She had asked, not out of pride or formality, but because she had truly needed him, and he had answered without hesitation. They stood there in silence for a moment, the cold wind tugging at their clothes. Somewhere in the distance, the battle still raged, but here, in this moment, it was just the two of them. She realized then that whatever came next, she could no longer deny the truth. She trusted him, and maybe, just maybe, she needed him more than she had ever needed anyone before. The northern wall loomed ahead, its black stone cracked from countless battles. Beyond it lay the outer wastelands, dangerous, but free from the constant patrols of the enemy. Lady Serenia and the human moved slowly along its edge, both exhausted, both carrying the weight of too many close escapes. His limp was worse now, and his shoulder was wrapped in a strip of cloth she had torn from her dress. Every step he took was a quiet act of stubborn strength. She stayed close to him, her hand hovering near his arm in case he stumbled. At last, they found a half-buried gate hidden under rubble. It was small, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. "This will take us out," he said, his voice rough from fatigue. "Out? To where?" she asked. "Somewhere safer than here," he replied, his eyes scanning the street for movement. For a moment, she simply stared at the gap in the wall. She had dreamed of escape since the night the palace fell, but now that the moment was here, something inside her hesitated. "If I leave," she said slowly, "I can return to my people, to my title, to my life before this." He didn't look at her, just checked his rifle one more time. "That's your choice," he said. "I'm just making sure you get the chance to make it." They crouched near the opening, listening for danger. The air was still, only the faint whistle of the wind passing through broken stone. She studied his face in the gray light. There was no expectation in his expression, no pressure. He had never once asked her for anything, not gratitude, not loyalty, not even trust. Everything he had done was his choice, not for reward, but because he believed it was right. A sudden noise cut through the quiet shouts in the distance. Growing closer, enemy voices, the metallic stomp of boots, the hum of a drone. "They've tracked us," he said, pulling her toward the gap. But instead of crawling through, she stayed frozen. "Go," he urged. "I'm not leaving without you," she said, her voice sharp. "I can hold them off," he replied. "You'll be safer out there, safer without you." she interrupted, her eyes blazing. No, he admitted. The voices were closer now. The light of the drone starting to flicker over the broken wall. He cursed under his breath and moved in front of her. Rifle ready, the first enemy soldier appeared. Weapon raised, the human fired, the shot echoing through the ruins. The alley became a blur of noise and light plasma bolts striking stone. The crack of rifle fire, the roar of the drone. Serenia stayed behind him. But when another soldier came from the side, she grabbed a chunk of rubble and hurled it with all her strength. Knocking the man off balance, the human finished him with a single shot. More soldiers fell, one after another. Finally, the street went quiet again. He lowered his rifle, breathing hard. The drone lay smoking on the ground, its red light fading. Now, he said, we move. They crawled through the gap together, the cold air of the wastelands hitting their faces. On the other side, the land stretched out in all directions, dry, open, and endless. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was freedom. They walked for a while in silence, the ruined city shrinking behind them. At last, Serenia spoke, her voice quiet. You risked everything for me. He glanced at her. Wouldn't be the first time. And I? She paused. I was wrong about you. They stopped at a small ridge, the wind sweeping over them. In the distance, the horizon glowed faintly with the light of another settlement. That's where we're going, he said, nodding toward it. She looked at the faint lights, then back at him. I could go back to my people. She said again, you could. He agreed, but I don't want to, she finished, her voice steady. His brows lifted slightly. Why not? Because wherever you're going, that's where I want to be, she said. Meeting his eyes without hesitation for a long moment, he just studied her then, for the first time since they met. He smiled, not the faint smirk he gave in the city, but a real smile, tired but genuine. All right, he said. But you'll have to keep up. I will, she replied. And this time, there was no pride in her tone, only determination. They turned toward the horizon together. The wind carried the faint sound of the ruined city behind them, but neither looked back. The bond they had forged in fire, blood, and trust was stronger than any title or empire. And as they walked side by side into the unknown, Lady Serenia knew her life would never belong to her old world again. It belonged to this path, and to the man who had never left her behind.